Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honorée Fanonne Jeffers. It's an epic saga that tells the story of several generations of a Black family from a small fictional town in Georgia. Spanning decades before the Civil War to the recent present, the story explores various facets of Black history and is tied together by the writing and philosophy of W.E.B. Du Bois. The book clocks in at an initially daunting 800-plus pages, but is an engrossing read that will go by quickly. Despite being Jeffers' first novel, it's masterfully written with a rich fictionalized history seemingly brought to life with a cast of complex and incredibly human characters. I think The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois is a book that you should read, but I don't want to spoil it for you by giving away too much of the story. Instead, I'm just going to speak in general terms, not really ascribing anything to any particular character. So hopefully you'll read the book and you'll get, for lack of a better term, the same sense of enjoyment that I got in reading it and experiencing the twists and turns in the lives of these people. Where do I begin with this book? Honestly, I don't even know, because to say that it's incredible doesn't seem to do it enough justice. I came across this book while looking for some titles to read and review for Black History Month. I got for Black History year-round, but with Black History Month in February, I always try to go a little bit harder. This year, I decided that I was going to have a theme of Black history, but also to combine it with Valentine's Day, so this thing of love and its different forms. I wanted a book that would be based on Black history, though not necessarily some great historical figure, but rather Black people through the ages. And with that, I thought the best thing would be a family. So I went searching through my book list and couldn't really find anything that fit the bill. I started looking through Goodreads, searching different tags, Amazon as well, seeing what would be referred, and I actually started reading a few books and then decided, no, this isn't quite right, and tabled them for another time. I don't even remember how I ended up coming across this book. It had pretty good ratings and it seemed like it would fit the bill. For a lot of books, I listen rather than read them, simply because with all the stuff I have going on, it's just easier for me to be able to listen while I'm doing tasks or like driving, things that don't require me to like look at them, right? But when I opened up this audiobook and saw it was like 30 hours long, it gave me pause for a moment. I had second thoughts because that's a lot of time. It's like a day plus. Initially, I thought maybe this is something that I should keep on the reading list, but I tried a few other books and they just weren't what I needed. So I decided, well, let me just listen to a little bit of it and I'll determine from there. Let me tell you, when I started listening to this book, the counter was at 30 hours. It wasn't a slow-going book, but I was watching the time counter. At first, it felt like, man, you're going to be here for a good minute listening to this book. And then I ended up getting so into the story that I looked up and was at 25% of the way there, then 30% of the way there without even realizing it. I got to the point where I listened to 20 hours, which was like the majority of the way through the book. And I'm now looking at it like I just have 10 hours left. And I started stressing because by that point, I'd gotten so wrapped up in the story, so vested in the characters that despite the book's length, I didn't want it to end. I wasn't looking forward to the end. The way that the book unravels is that you have multiple stories within the book, similar to Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, Roots by Alex Haley, or Jubilee by Margaret Walker. These really great books that tell the history of a family and through that Black history through eras and generations. The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois is very much like that, with the difference being that those books are pretty linear and follow a chronological timeline. The Garfield family forms the nucleus of the story. It consists of a father, Jeff, mother, Maybelle, though she's known as Belle, and their three daughters, Lydia, Coco, and Ailey. But the book mostly follows the female family members and centers on the female characters. Belle comes from humble means in Chickasetta, Georgia, a small fictional country town, while Jeff is from a well-to-do family, like his family's from somewhere in the north, though the city's never really named. The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois touches on the lives of several characters, but its anchor is Ailey. The difference in coverage is that the book drops in on particular moments in the lives of the other characters, but serves as Ailey's coming-of-age story. So it follows her from about the age of, I think she's like 3 or 5 when the book starts, up to her 30s. You get a fairly complete accounting of Ailey, Belle, and Lydia, where it follows them pretty much from their birth and tells their story in great detail. Some of the other characters, you get the story of their life, but it's in a more summarized fashion. You get info about their birth, maybe their parents, but from there, it's really just key points and highlights throughout their lives. This is a work of fiction, but being very vested in Ailey's story, it started to feel like she was a real person. Like, this is someone that you know because you've read about her life from the very beginning. You see her moving along her path, and it's not just the highlights. You pretty much see her grow up over the course of the book. She has moments and goes through life milestones, early romances, and moments from childhood to her being a teenager and a young adult. You see her do great things, and then you see her do not so great things. And because of the complexity of the character, because of the amount of time that you spend with the character, she ends up feeling incredibly realistic, flawed, and human. I would say about like halfway through, I was so caught up in her story because a good amount of time is spent with her that, prior to her story, there was this telling of, well, actually, the book begins with a man several generations back, right? Like an ancestor of Ailey's. And you get some overview of his story. And then it starts to go into his descendants because he's related to Ailey. His story was fine, but because you don't spend as much time with him, he's not the primary focus of the book. It's really just to give you some grounding. I felt like his section was fine, but once they got into Ailey's, that's when the book really took off for me. When she was a little kid, that was fine. I didn't find her so interesting then. But it was used as a way of kind of starting off her story, but also giving you a feel for the people around her. The book would then at points leave her story and reach back into the past to one of her ancestors, and then it would come back and continue on with her story. There's some drama early on in the book with her sister Lydia, as there would continue to be throughout the book. But early on, because she's a little kid, there's not much going on with her exactly, but rather you're just seeing the world through her eyes, and her not being fully aware of or understanding everything that's happening. As the story progresses and she gets older, things start to make more sense. You get a better understanding of not just what's going on at that point, but you get a different perspective on things that happened in the past. By the time she got to college or so, I was thoroughly vested in her story. Really, probably high school. It kind of got to the point where I felt like when they started shifting to her ancestors and her other relatives, I would actually be a little bit annoyed because I want to know what was going to happen next in her story. I want to know what's coming next with the lead, right? And so I was caught off guard because at one point, the book shifted to her mother, Maybelle, or Belle. And so with that, you get the story of how Ailey's mother and father met, Maybelle's life prior to that, how she met Ailey's dad when they were in college and unexpectedly became pregnant, and the way that it altered the path that she'd set for herself, this vision of the life that she had for herself. Things that she wanted to accomplish and achieve, but in having children and some drama in the early years of their marriage, it ended up changing the course of her life. I'd been so caught up in Aileen's story that when Belle's story first began, I was like, I want to get back to what's going on with Ailey. But then it's like Belle's story ended up being so interesting that it's like I got all caught up in that as well. And I wanted to know more about what was going on. But as with many of these other characters, the story shifts to her, but seemingly it only went up to a certain point. You spend a good amount of time with her, but it wasn't as in-depth. Her story isn't running concurrently with Aileen's once Aileen is born. Rather, her story gets told from her childhood up to a certain point. So like a significant moment in her life and her relationship with Aileen's father. And then past that point, it shifts back to Aileen. Where even when the book later shifted to Aileen's eldest sister, Lydia, who was Belle's first child, well, the couple's first child, I got into her story pretty quickly because by that point, I'd kind of gotten a feel for the rhythm of the book where it's going to shoot to this other character, but hang tight is going back to Aileen. Characters do things in the book that you don't quite understand because you're seeing it from Aileen's perspective. But then the story would shift, tell you about them and their life and things that they've been through. And it would help to put these things that Aileen was experiencing or that she was witnessing into perspective. It would give them better context. So while initially other characters would do things and you might think, well, that doesn't really make sense, or you might be inclined to judge them for it or to make assumptions, when the story would then shift to their perspective, telling you not just about how they felt in that moment, was different. I thoroughly like Aileen. I ended up liking a lot of these other characters as well, right? I ended up being very vested in their stories. Unfortunately, Lydia, as she gets older, ends up having some substance abuse issues, which is an unfortunate thing that a lot of people struggle with. But because we move past the point of being on the outside looking in, when the story shifts to her perspective, you start to understand some of the things that occurred in her life that other family members were aware of, things that she's been carrying for years. And then even in trying to move past those things, experiences that she has in her early life that are incredibly traumatizing, right? Even later in her life, traumatizing things she experiences. And with that, she becomes a huge source of the book's drama. Like when Aileen is in, I think, high school or maybe junior high, something along those lines. Lydia comes home from college and she brings this boyfriend and a bunch of drama ensues. And with that, there's like a falling out with the family. During this period of disconnect, Lydia goes through some incredibly traumatizing things in her life. It turns out that at first glance, again, being on the outside looking in, you might pass judgment or make assumptions. Or rather, the family passes judgment and makes assumptions about this boyfriend. But then when the story shifts to Lydia's perspective and you get a better understanding of this guy and their relationship, his name is Dante. Turns out that he's actually like a really nice guy. Well-intentioned, though misguided, but he's a decent guy. Much as Lydia, he's trying to do the best that he can to survive. He makes mistakes in his life, much as Lydia. And I think in some part that helps to draw the two of them together, and that they're both carrying around these private hurts. And within each other, they find a source of support. Someone else that knows what they're going through. And not that they necessarily enable each other, but it offers them the support and love that they need. Unfortunately, there's some other factors at play that become involved, and it ends up having devastating consequences. Throughout pretty much all of the stories, there's this thing of people, they have experiences in their lives that we on the outside, regardless of them being our family members, being our friends, you never really know anyone else's story without them telling you, because we generally don't walk in other people's shoes. While you might know a person, there's really no one in the world that you spend every waking moment with. You might know another person pretty well, but you don't know another person better than you know yourself, or better than they know themselves. Simply because the culmination of their experiences, their childhood, the things that they see, the things that they've endured, all of those little moments in their lives add up to make them who they are. When you have interactions with them, the way that they deal with things or how they react in situations or the decisions that they make, being on the outside looking in, we perceive those things through our experiences, but we don't fully have like an understanding of them and how they experience things. What the book does here is that it allows you to see particular moments from the perspective of different people, but with the added context, with the added benefit of having witnessed their development and knowing the things they've gone through in life. So not only do you see things from different people's perspectives, but you also see it through the lens of their experiences. That was incredibly interesting because most of the characters are actually pretty decent people. Aside from like one or two characters, you don't have anyone that's like an out and out villain. And even with those people that do terrible things, some of it is a result of the experiences that they've had in their lives. There's an ancestor of Aileen's named Samuel Pichard, and he's a terrible man. But we get to find out about him being a terrible man after learning about his childhood, abuse that he suffers at the hands of his father as a small child. And so we see it's kind of like this thing of hurt people hurting people, where they've had these negative traumatic experiences, which then affects who they are as people. It affects how they move through the world. That's not to say that everyone that's had a problematic childhood or that might have endured abuse as a child will themselves grow up to become abusers, but rather that in this particular case, with this specific man, it did. Here, it's not an excuse, but rather an explanation, an understanding as to how he became the person he came to be. You then see how the dysfunction that he grew up with, the abuse that he suffered at the hands of his father, how that then affected his development as a man and his outlook on the world, and how that then trickles down through the generations. You endure highs and lows as you witness highs and lows in the lives of these people. You root for them. Your heart breaks for them at particular moments, the loss of loved ones, setbacks that they experience, or things just simply not going their way. All of these things, that's like what life is. It's not sunshine and rainbows all the time. You have good moments, but sometimes, unfortunately, there are also bad times. Typically with my book reviews, I try to dive deeply into them to discuss themes and symbolism. With this book, I feel like to say that I enjoy it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like the right word, because when I think of enjoy, it sounds like something happy, a positive moment. And not to say that there aren't moments like that in this book. There are moments where like you laugh and giggle, but it's like life. So there's also sad moments. There are moments where characters endure trauma. So I don't know what the right word would be that would best describe this, but I think it's an incredible book in which I became very vested in the story and the characters. There are twists and turns, but not in that like melodramatic cliffhanger sense. Rather just that with these people moving through life, there are unexpected moments. There are plans that they make and things kind of go wrong. They don't go according to plan because that's what happened. A theme throughout this book, or a phrase that would apply to the book, is, as I said, this thing of hurt people hurting people, where I don't think that people by default, or most people raised in positive circumstances, would grow up to be bad people. I believe that most people on the spectrum of good to bad fall somewhere in the middle. And I feel like most lean towards being good, decent people. Those who are saintly, for lack of a better term, and those who are evil are like the outliers. They're the exceptions rather than the rule. Reading this book, where pretty much everyone has a flaw in some way, as most people do, they kind of fall on the spectrum in like the same place, where really you just have one or two characters who are what I would term evil. And in large part, that has to do with how they were raised. In the case of Sam Bachard, where he grew up in a very dysfunctional household, and that seriously influenced him as well as some of these other people. He ended up being a slave master, as did some of these people, in the past and around him. He then has a son who doesn't experience the same dysfunction, because by this point, his father, as a result of owning slaves and some other dealings, is wealthy, if not financially comfortable. And so Sam doesn't abuse his son in the way that he was abused by his father, but yet still, in part because of the environment in which he's growing up, there's this sense of entitlement to having dominion and control over the people around him, which I don't think is a positive environment or a positive way to raise a child, where every and anything that they want, they get. It's raising your child to be a spoiled brat. You don't want your child to be deprived, but at the same time, you need to teach your kids boundaries. You need to teach them respect. You need them to teach them not to disrespect themselves, but to also respect other people, and that the way you interact with people matters. Those lack of boundaries and his father covering up his faults instead of correcting them, it's like he's not abusive to his son, but he doesn't do right by him in raising him this way. Sam sees it as helping him, or what he's supposed to do as a father in protecting his son. But it's like he's not protecting his son, but rather shielding him from accountability for his wrongdoings, excusing his wrongdoings. And that's dysfunctional in its own way. There's this thing with the three female characters, the three main characters, Aileen, her mom, and her sister. This thing, especially with Aileen, Lydia, and Coco, which is like their other sister, the middle child. The things that people experience in their childhood, right? They carry those things with them into adulthood. And those things can seriously affect you. Even when you have food, you have shelter, you have a roof over your head, you still need to feel safe and protected from an emotional standpoint. It's like a balancing game where you have to satisfy these basic needs, these survival needs of, let's say, food, shelter, clothing, things like that. But at the same time, that has to be balanced with your emotional and psychological needs. These three things, as we see throughout the book, need to be in balance as like a child is growing up, to ensure that they become a mentally healthy, well-adjusted adult. Because if any one of those things is out of whack, it's not definite, but there's a real chance that when they enter adulthood, that they'll have difficulties, that they're going to face hardships and struggles in life. Having to deal with that imbalance from your childhood will affect you into your adulthood. Sometimes it can have very devastating consequences. Taking a step away from the book, it's like people that endure sexual abuse, or they grow up neglected, or they grow up with their parents being alcoholics or drug addicts, or even if you grew up in a household where like your physical needs, your survival needs were being met. You have a roof over your head and whatnot, but your parents don't actually spend any time with you. Your parents aren't feeding you emotionally. They're not nurturing you emotionally. That can also have a negative effect on you. Think about the amount of people that grow up and they have rich parents, or like their parents are at least financially comfortable, but yet when they enter adulthood, they're so unhappy. It's like you have all of the material trappings of success, but you're still miserable. Sure, your physical needs have to be met, but your emotional needs have to be addressed as well. And I think that's like an incredible theme throughout the book. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.